She stood on her new front step in 1960, moving van still idling, 10 seconds to greet the stranger walking toward her with a basket. Nobody had taught her this rule. By 1960, greeting a stranger in America was not one rule. It was several rules stacked on top of each other, inherited from a Gilded Age system of calling cards and formal introductions that had never been designed for a country full of brand-new subdivisions. Emily Post had codified the Old World in 1922. Amy Vanderbilt updated it for the new one in 1952. Between those two books lived an entire etiquette of the handshake, the hat, and the first name, and every well-raised woman was expected to know which rule applied and when. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. A man was introduced to a woman, not the other way around. The words themselves mattered. You did not say, "Mr. Jones, meet Mrs. Smith." You said, "Mrs. Smith, may I present Mr. Jones," and the order was not casual. It was a small act of deference, performed correctly or not at all. The hierarchy did not stop at gender. Younger people were presented to older people. Someone new to a circle was presented to someone established in it. A junior officer's wife was presented to a senior officer's wife, and everyone in the room understood exactly where they stood without a single word of explanation. It sounds rigid today. It felt at the time like knowing exactly where to put your feet on a dance floor you had never seen before. Here is the part that surprises people. The handshake between a man and a woman was not automatic. It was hers to offer. Etiquette manuals of the period were explicit. A man did not extend his hand first to a woman he had just met. He waited. If she offered her hand, he took it. If she simply nodded, that nodded. Greeting was the correct and complete exchange. No explanation required. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. Think about the last time you met someone and felt the awkward half-second of not knowing whether to shake, wave, or just say hi. That confusion did not exist for a woman in 1960 walking into a room of strangers. The rule told her what to do before she even crossed the threshold, and that certainty was its own kind of comfort. And this is where the modern myth falls apart. We like to imagine the 1950s as an era where everyone was friendlier, where strangers on the street struck up easy conversation. The truth is closer to the opposite. Talking to someone you had not been properly introduced to was not warm. It was presumptuous. The entire architecture of formal greeting existed to prevent random, undirected mixing between people who did not yet have a reason to know each other. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. She knew that a scripted greeting was not cold. It was efficient. It let a stranger become a known quantity in 4 words or less, without either party having to guess or risk embarrassing the other. That efficiency took a lifetime to learn and about 1 generation to forget completely. Consider the words themselves. How do you do was the standard greeting between strangers being introduced, and it was never meant to be answered honestly. The only correct reply to how do you do was to say, how do you do right back. If you actually told someone how you were doing, you had made a small social error, because the phrase was not a question at all. It was a password. The wording carried real weight, and etiquette writers spent pages on the difference between how do you do, which was reserved for a first meeting, and how are you, which was for someone you already knew. Mixing the two up marked you instantly as someone who had not been taught properly. Nobody would say anything about it out loud. They would simply notice. Now picture the man on the sidewalk. Hat etiquette was not decoration. When a man passed a woman he knew or was introduced to one on the street, he was expected to tip his hat or lift it briefly. Inside a building, in an elevator with a woman present, the hat came off entirely. This was not vanity. It was a visible, repeatable signal of respect that anyone on the street could read instantly. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. The hat itself said something before a single word was spoken. Its style, its condition, the way it was worn, all of it signaled class and occasion long before the man underneath it opened his mouth. A greeting in 1960 began with what you were wearing, not what you said. Titles were the other entry point. and they were not optional.
Mr., Mrs., Miss Dr. Reverend.
A stranger was addressed by title and surname, full stop, even after a formal introduction. Using someone's first name without an explicit invitation to do so, something like please, call me Helen, was considered presumptuous, especially across an age or status gap. That invitation was itself a small ceremony. Being asked to use someone's first name was a signal that the relationship had shifted, that you had been let a little closer in. Today we hand out first names to strangers within seconds of meeting them, at a coffee counter, in an email, on a name tag. In 1960, a first name was earned, not assumed, and everyone understood the difference. None of this was uniform across the country, and it is worth saying plainly. The South held on to elaborate formal address longer than the urban Northeast. Sir and ma'am were baseline address to any adult stranger, young or old. Well past the point, those words had faded from casual use in New York or Chicago. Etiquette writers of the period devoted entire chapters to these regional differences because the differences were real and Americans genuinely got tripped up by them when they traveled. Small towns kept the old habits alive longer than cities did as well. In a town where most faces were familiar, a nod or a spoken greeting to any passerby, stranger or not, was simply expected. In a growing city, anonymity among strangers had already become normal by 1960. The same country was quietly running two different social rulebooks depending on which sidewalk you were standing on. Now step back into the world that built these rules in the first place. Late in the 19th century, the calling card system among wealthy urban families had become almost absurdly elaborate. A woman calling on another household left a card, folded a specific corner to signal her intention, and the whole exchange followed rules so intricate that entire chapters of etiquette books were devoted to the folding alone. Emily Post inherited that world and simplified it for a new American middle class hungry to look and act correctly. Her book, first published in 1922, became the reference point millions of Mickemels kept on a shelf, not because they needed to plan a formal calling schedule, but because knowing the rules, even rules you rarely used, was its own form of respectability. Then came the Depression, and the entire structure buckled. Households that had once employed a servant to answer the door and manage calling cards could no longer afford one. The old system assumed staff. Without staff, a housewife had to learn to do the greeting herself, and the elaborate choreography of Victorian calling began quietly simplifying out of necessity rather than fashion. War finished what the Depression started. Rationing lines, troop trains, USO dances, and war work factory floors threw people of wildly different backgrounds together at a scale the old hierarchy had never been built to handle. A factory girl from Ohio and a debutante from Connecticut might find themselves standing in the same line, and no calling card in the world could sort that out fast enough. By the time the war ended, America had a new problem the old etiquette had never anticipated. Millions of families moved into brand new subdivisions at once, entire streets of strangers with no shared history, no family name anyone recognized, and no calling card network to be introduced through. The presentation system assumed you already had a social web. Levittown had no web at all, only fresh concrete driveways. Something had to fill the gap, and something did. A company founded back in 1928 in Memphis, Tennessee had built a small business around exactly this problem, sending a hostess to greet newcomers with a basket of local coupons and introductions. By the post-war boom, that company had a name every housewife in a new subdivision would come to recognize on sight. The Welcome Wagon was not a charity and not a government program. It was a business. And its entire premise was that the old introduction system had simply stopped working for millions of Americans. If nobody was going to make the first formal greeting in a subdivision full of strangers, somebody would have to invent an institution to do it professionally, basket and all. Think about what that says. An entire commercial industry existed in the 1950s for the sole purpose of solving a problem that used to be handled by unwritten social knowledge. That is how real the gap was. Suburbia did not gradually loosen the old rules. It broke them outright, fast enough that a company had to be built almost overnight to patch the hole. The gap showed up in the mail, too. Two advice columnists, twin sisters writing under the names Ann Landers and Dear Abby, launched their columns in 1955 and 1956, and both were flooded with letters from women asking a version of the same question. How do I greet my new neighbor? Do I use her first name or her married name? Who calls on whom first? Those letters are proof of something important. Ordinary American women in the 1950s were not calmly following a settled tradition. They were anxious and genuinely unsure, writing to strangers in a newspaper because their own mothers had grown up in small towns or old city neighborhoods where everybody already knew everybody, and nobody had prepared them for a cul-de-sac full of people they had never met. In 1952, Amy Vanderbilt published her own answer to that anxiety. Her complete book of etiquette became a bestseller precisely because it addressed the new suburban and business world more directly than Post's older editions had. Vanderbilt wrote for a woman standing on a driveway in a brand new development, not a woman managing a household staff on Fifth Avenue. Vanderbilt did not throw out the old hierarchy. She kept the man introduced to woman rule, kept the deference to age and rank, kept the careful use of titles. What she added was practical guidance for situations Post's Gilded Age framework had never imagined, like greeting a co-worker's spouse at an office party, or introducing yourself to a neighbor without any shared social connection at all. By 1960, the two books together formed the working manual of an entire generation of American women, Post for the formal architecture, Vanderbilt for the everyday application. Emily Post herself died that September, and her institute continued revising the book under her name, meaning the very year our story is set in was already a hinge point, the old authority passing to a new hand. Now picture the receiving line, because this was the codified answer for greeting many strangers at once. At a wedding or a formal reception, guests moved through in order, host first, then hostess, then the guest of honor, each person announced by name so nobody had to guess who they were shaking hands with. It turned a room of strangers into a manageable sequence, one greeting at a time. The line existed because a formal party could easily hold 100 people who had never met, and without an order, greeting everyone would descend into chaos or, worse, snubbing someone by accident. The line solved a real logistical problem, the same way a receiving system at a modern conference badge table solves one today, except this one ran on names and titles instead of printed badges. For a military or diplomatic wife, the rules went further still. Etiquette writers of the era, Vanderbilt especially, laid out an entire separate protocol built on rank rather than wealth. A newly arrived officer's wife was often expected to leave her calling card with the commanding officer's wife within a day or two of arriving at a new post, following an unwritten but strictly enforced local schedule. That world was slower to change than the suburbs, because rank itself was the organizing principle, and rank does not move house the way a civilian family does. A diplomatic posting or a military assignment came with an instruction manual of its own, often literally, and calling card etiquette survived there decades after it had faded from ordinary civilian life. Even the telephone had a script. When a woman of a certain household answered the family phone, the correct greeting was not a bare hello. It was her own identity, something closer to Mrs. Harold Whitfield's residence, spoken as though she were opening a formal introduction to whoever was on the other end of the line. That phrasing did real work. It told the caller instantly whether they had reached the household they intended, distinguished the lady of the house from a maid, a daughter, or a wrong number, and did it all before either party had said anything else. A telephone greeting in 1960 was, in miniature, the exact same presentation logic that governed a formal party. Now walk into the department store, because a stranger greeting a stranger across a sales counter followed its own careful version of the rules. A saleswoman greeting a customer she had never met said "Good morning" or "May I help you?" and nothing more personal than that. Addressing a customer by name or in familiar terms was considered an overreach of her position, not a friendly gesture. That single detail tells you how deeply class was woven into even the smallest exchange. Stranger etiquette was never only about gender or age. It was about position, and everyone on both sides of the counter understood exactly what tone was permitted and what tone was not, without a single word of it ever being posted on a wall. The good manners, remember, even when we forget. Part of this story is how much thought went into protecting a stranger from embarrassment. Every one of these rules, the hat, the title, the scripted phone greeting, existed to make sure nobody was caught guessing in public. Good etiquette was not about performance. It was about mercy toward people who did not yet know each other well enough to improvise safely. Now consider a wedding specifically, because it concentrated nearly every rule we have discussed into one afternoon. Guests were greeted at the door, seated by an usher according to which side of the family they belonged to, moved through a receiving line afterward, and addressed the bride's mother and the groom's mother by title long before any first names were exchanged, if they ever were at all. A single misstep at that wedding, using a first name too early, offering a hand a woman had not offered first, forgetting to remove a hat indoors, would not have caused a scene. Nobody would have said a word, but it would have been noticed, quietly filed away, and remembered by the very people whose good opinion mattered most in a small community. This is why children were drilled on greeting etiquette long before they understood why it mattered. A child was taught to stand when an adult entered the room, to say, "How do you do?" rather than "Hi," and to wait for an adult to extend a hand rather than offering one first. It was not about obedience for its own sake. It was early training for a lifetime of correctly reading a room full of strangers. Boys and girls were taught slightly different versions of the same lesson. A boy learned to stand when a woman entered a room and to wait for her hand before offering his own. A girl learned that she was never obligated to shake hands with anyone, that a polite nod was always an acceptable substitute, and that she alone decided how close a stranger was allowed to get, literally and socially, from the very first meeting. That early lesson had a real purpose beyond politeness. It gave a young woman, well before she ever attended her first formal party, a built-in sense of control over how strangers approached her. In a world without the casual physical contact common today, a handshake was never assumed. It was requested, and she was the one who granted it or declined it. Now, let's talk about how fast all of this began to erode, because it did not take a century. It took roughly a decade. Through the 1960s, fewer men wore hats at all, a broader shift in menswear that had nothing directly to do with etiquette and everything to do with changing fashion. Yet it quietly erased one of the most visible greeting gestures in American life almost by accident. First names spread faster too, especially in casual and suburban settings, and especially in the West, where new communities had fewer old social hierarchies to enforce the slower approach. A neighbor who might have waited months for permission to use a first name in 1955 might simply introduce herself by her first name outright by the late 1960s, and nobody blinked. By the middle of the decade, the counterculture had begun openly rejecting formal etiquette as a symbol of everything it distrusted about the older generation. A firm handshake, a proper title, a tipped hat, these were no longer neutral courtesies. To a young person questioning authority, they started to look like the establishment's costume, worn by people who had built a war and a rigid social order that the young no longer wanted to inherit. That is the real hinge of this entire story. The old rules did not simply go out of fashion the way a hemline does. They were deliberately, publicly rejected by a generation that associated formality with authority it no longer trusted. And once that association took hold, no amount of etiquette book revision could bring the old system back to universal practice. By the 1970s, calling cards had essentially vanished from ordinary social life, surviving mostly as the business card handed across a desk rather than left on a silver tray in an entrance hall. The presentation hierarchy, man introduced to woman, younger to older, faded from daily use for most Americans, though it never fully died. It simply retreated to the places that had always guarded it most fiercely. Those places still exist. A formal military change of command ceremony, a White House state dinner, a traditional Southern debutante ball, a high formal wedding with a real receiving line and place cards spelling out full names and titles. Walk into any of those rooms today, and you will still find fragments of 1960s greeting rules, quietly surviving in the one kind of occasion where nobody wants to risk getting it wrong. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. And here is the proof. Anyone who has ever attended a black tie fundraiser, a formal military ball, or a traditional wedding and felt the sudden relief of a clear script, stand here, say this, wait for that, knows exactly how much calmer a scripted greeting feels than an improvised one. The rule did not stop working. We simply stopped teaching it. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and modern etiquette coaches have started rediscovering exactly that. A small but growing industry of manners consultants, especially since roughly 2020, has been marketing a very specific pitch. Bring back the handshake. Bring back the proper introduction. Their argument is not nostalgia for its own sake. It is that ambiguity itself is exhausting. Think about the last party you walked into where you genuinely did not know whether to shake hands, wave, hug, or say nothing at all. That half-second of hesitation, repeated at every single first meeting of your life, is precisely the friction the old system was built to eliminate. Modern social anxiety research increasingly points to exactly this kind of ambiguity as a quiet, constant drain most people never name out loud. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. And that certainty, more than any single gesture, is what modern viewers are actually nostalgic for. Not the hats, not the calling cards, the simple, quiet confidence of never having to guess how to greet a stranger. Because someone had already worked out the answer generations before you were born. The Emily Post Institute still exists today, still run by her descendants, still publishing updated guidance for a country that never actually resolved the question her great-grandmother-in-law's book first tried to answer in 1922. The fact that it continues to operate more than a century later tells you the underlying problem never went away. Only the single, agreed-upon answer did. Let's go back to the receiving line one more time, because the order itself was never arbitrary. Consider it laid out plainly. The host stood first, closest to the door, because he was responsible for welcoming everyone into his home. The hostess came next, because she managed the household the guest was now entering. The guest of honor came last in the line, so that every single guest had already been formally received before reaching the person the party was actually for. That structure meant a stranger walking into a room full of unfamiliar faces never had to figure out where to start. There was exactly one correct entry point, and everyone, host, guest, and honoree alike, played their part in it without deviation. Compare that to walking into a modern party today, scanning the room, hoping to spot one familiar face before anyone notices you standing alone by the door. The same logic extended to how a hostess seated her table. Guests were placed according to precedence, age, marital status, professional standing, so that even the seating chart itself communicated who a stranger was before a single word passed between dinner companions. Sitting next to someone at a formal dinner in 1960 was, in a small way, already an introduction. Compare that carefully engineered dinner table to a modern potluck, where guests seat themselves however they like, and strangers are left to sort out on their own who they are and how they should talk to each other. Neither approach is wrong. But one of them handed a stranger a map before she ever sat down, and the other hands her nothing at all. Let's talk about geography for a moment, because the regional variation in these rules is genuinely fascinating and rarely discussed. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, old family enclaves kept calling card customs alive well past their expiration date elsewhere. because those cities had generations-deep social registers that made the old formal system worth maintaining. New money simply had less use for it. Washington, D.C. held onto formal introduction rules longest of all, and for an obvious reason. Diplomatic protocol demanded it. An ambassador's greeting to a foreign dignitary was not a personal preference. It was a matter of international courtesy with real consequences, and the careful presentation hierarchy of the old etiquette books mapped almost perfectly onto the demands of formal diplomacy. It is worth pausing here on what all of this really protected. Underneath the hats, the titles, and the calling cards was a single shared goal: to make sure a stranger never felt lost in a room. Every rule we have covered, however fussy it sounds today, existed to hand a nervous newcomer a script sturdy enough to lean on. That is easy to romanticize and just as easy to dismiss, and the honest answer sits somewhere in between. The old system protected people from social embarrassment beautifully. It also, quietly and effectively, kept people in their assigned place and made it very hard for anyone outside the right family, the right title, or the right neighborhood to simply walk in and be greeted as an equal. That is exactly why the suburbs broke the system so quickly. Levittown and its imitators were for the first time genuinely mixing families of different backgrounds: war veterans on the GI Bill, factory foremen, young engineers, all buying nearly identical houses on nearly identical streets. The old hierarchy had no ready answer for a neighborhood where nobody outranked anybody else on paper. And so the Welcome Wagon hostess, in her small and practical way, was doing something almost democratic. She greeted every new family the same way, basket and all, regardless of what name was on the moving truck or what accent came out the door. It was not designed as social reform. It was designed to sell local advertising. But it flattened the old hierarchy anyway, one basket at a time. There is something quietly moving in that. A commercial gimmick, invented in 1928 to sell coupons, ended up doing more to flatten a century of formal social hierarchy in the way ordinary Americans greeted each other than any etiquette book ever intended to. Sometimes the old rules did not get gently retired. They got replaced by whoever showed up first with a basket and a smile. Now think about what your own grandmother might have told you if she grew up in this exact world. She likely remembers exactly which relatives insisted on titles at every visit, exactly which neighbor called on her mother the week they moved in, and exactly how it felt the first time someone important enough to matter finally said, "Please, call me by my first name." Those small memories are the real inheritance here, more than the hats or the calling cards themselves. They are proof that a stranger's first 10 seconds with you used to matter enough that entire books were written about it, entire childhoods were spent practicing it, and entire industries were built to manage it when the old system finally could not keep up. It is worth remembering, too, that these rules were never meant to be cold. Every etiquette writer of the period, Post included, insisted that the true purpose of manners was kindness made efficient, a way of making sure nobody in the room ever felt unwelcome, unseen, or unsure of their footing, even for a moment. We tend to picture the woman who followed these rules as constrained by them. It is worth considering the opposite. She walked into any room in America, a wedding, a military post, a brand new subdivision, and she never once had to wonder what to do first. That is not a small thing. That is a kind of freedom modern strangers, armed only with an awkward wave and a guess, rarely get to feel. So when we look back at 1960 and ask why everyone greeted strangers differently, the honest answer is that they did not entirely. They followed a shared structure that flexed by region, by rank, by neighborhood, and by generation, but that structure existed everywhere in some form, because Americans of that era simply refused to leave a stranger standing in a doorway without a script to follow. We lost most of that structure within a single generation, not because it stopped working, but because the world it was built for, the receiving lines, the calling cards, the households with staff to manage them, mostly disappeared first. The rules did not fail. The stage they were built for was struck, and nobody ever built a new one to replace it completely. That is worth sitting with for a moment. We did not choose to abandon the comfort of knowing exactly how to greet a stranger. It slipped away underneath a much bigger set of changes: suburban sprawl, generational rebellion, the slow disappearance of the hat. And by the time anyone noticed it was gone, there was no single rulebook left to bring it back. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and maybe that is the real gift hiding in all of this. Not the hat, not the calling card, but the idea that a stranger deserves a clear, kind, unmistakable welcome, and that giving her one is worth thinking through carefully rather than leaving to chance. That much, at least, we can still choose to remember. If this took you back to your own mother's front porch, or reminded you of a rule you never knew had a name, you know exactly where to find more of it. Good manners, remember, even when we forget, and there is a whole shelf of these forgotten rules still waiting here for you. Come back next time, and bring your tea.